some of the big problems that I see here, we can have that next slide. The problems that really presented in this council, in this decision to split, these cultural reasons, are really problems that Soong-Chan's going to get into and that I see still existed in the church today, and really what's hindering us around racial reconciliation. There's a lot, but some of the things I want to hit on is the first one being the assumption of normality. And what I mean by that is one of the biggest things that hindered the council from coming to and really hearing each other on how they were talking about Jesus was this assumption that my culture is right and yours is wrong, right? That the way I talk about Jesus, the way I describe him as having one physis and one prosopon and two physis, and the way you're talking about him is you're wrong and I'm right, right? Both sides fully believed in the divinity of Jesus, right? So for any people that are getting scared and saying, oh, he's attacking like crucial doctrines of the faith, both sides believed in the divinity of Jesus, right? Both of them believed in the incarnation, but they had different ways of describing them according to their culture. One of the biggest problems that the Africans had with this is that, which is still the case today, Westerners like to divide everything, right? Western people like to compartmentalize every aspect of life. So they had a different word for nature versus person. So it wasn't in contrast with their culture that they received from Plato and the Stoics to say that there was one person but two natures. Ethiopians, for example, they didn't have such a delineation. They didn't have a way of saying Jesus had one nature and two persons, or one person. That didn't make sense to them. They had one word in Giz, the language of Ethiopians in the ancient times. They had one word to describe both nature and person. So when they heard that, they were hearing the West saying Jesus is two people, so they felt they were defending orthodoxy. So it was a cultural linguistic argument, right, where people didn't have the opportunity to really hear each other. And so what happens is, and this gets into the second problem, those with power were able to shut down those without power. And now, until this day, Christianity is seen as this Western thing, and it's owned by Westerners. So when you add these assumptions, that my way is right, your way is wrong, like for example, I remember last year, a couple years ago, when we had a church plant in Boston, we had this opportunity to have a gathering of Christian pastors. It was actually a Haitian gathering of Haitian pastors, and then I was there in the middle of this, and it was kind of cool because I felt like this honored guest, and it was a good old-fashioned revival service. We were taking turns preaching and everything. But if anybody knows anything about the Haitian immigrant Christian community, you know that there is kind of a little bit of a subtle tension between the Baptists and the Pentecostals in the Haitian community, and that's the case in a lot of contexts. But in Haiti, the largest Christian groups are Pentecostals and Baptists, and there's a little bit of not so much theological, but more just practical, ecumenical differences. And there was this moment in one of the services where people started, they started catching the Holy Ghost, and people started, doing different things, and some of it was even different for me, and I saw this happening, and I saw people shaking and kind of like walking around. And they would do this thing where they would walk around and put chairs on their head, and they would walk in circles with a chair on their head. And some women would put purses on their head, and it was just really interesting. And I was like, "Wow, this is amazing! This is awesome! I love seeing like contextualized worship." But some of the Haitian Baptists were not comfortable with this, and they were like, "This is not cool. This is voodoo. This is this is wrong, right?" So there was this assumption going on that is wrong. And we see this all the time, and we see there's so many examples we could share about this. But when you add the unequal distribution of power to that, then those with power can be the ones who decide what is right and what is wrong and how we worship God. Right? And then the last thing I'd like to share is something that I cannot stress enough is this color blindness thing. And that's something that I think that is more of a modern problem that I think Soong-Chan can speak to better. It's more of a modern problem in the sense that we're talking about what happened at Chalcedon, and it wasn't as much of an issue then because people knew who they were. There was and that was really a lot of the reason why when the West decided to make this statement, a lot of the Egyptians and the Syrians, they were like, forget that. We're not signing that. We reject it because it goes against our culture. It goes against who we are. And so Egyptian Christian, if you go to Coptic church, if you go to Ethiopian church, they're very adamant about their identity, their culture, and they reject that wholeheartedly. It's about their culture. Because they were in a different context where they really owned their culture more. We're in a different place today. People today like to be colorblind. And so I would even say that we're at more of a disadvantage than people were back then because we have assumptions of normality, but we don't even know we have them because we're colorblind. And I believe we talk about this with white people, but I believe this is true for minorities as well. In our politically correct postmodern age, we don't want to stereotype and we don't want to generalize, which I agree are bad things. But we go into this other spectrum of being colorblind and acting like we're all the same, right? but we're not all the same. So when we're acting, when we're proceeding as if we're the same, but we clearly have differences in how we worship and how we talk about Jesus, you know, the way that we describe Jesus, the words we use, the way we do church, then we will just naturally, just coincidentally find ourselves with people like ourselves, and we'll have the segregation in the churches that we have today. So, but I'm going to turn it over to Soong-Chan at this point, who can probably do a little bit better job than I can about talking about some of the more modern trends. But before we do that, I wanted to just see if there was just any questions or clarifications about any of the history stuff or any of the Christological controversy, anything like that.